Hello.
Hello, we're back.
Yep. Nehemiah.
Yes. And we are into the rebuilding of the temple and all the conflict that happens while that is going on.
Mm-hmm.
We're past the kings of Israel and Judah, and now we're in the exile, but there is still hope.
Yeah. I think Nehemiah is my favorite Bible character.
Okay, why?
I just like him. I like the way that he acts. I think part of it is I just relate to him. I don't know necessarily why I relate to him. It's not like I have, my people are not, I'm not in the situation where I'm finding out that my city is destroyed and I want to go back and rebuild it. But I think I just love verse 4
of chapter 1.
Of chapter 1. I think
yes.
I just love.
Yes.
I love Nehemiah's reaction. I love the way that he turns to God. Right. It says, "As soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven." And I think I want that to be my reaction so often to things. Not necessarily weeping and mourning, but I think nobody wants to weep and mourn, right?
But fasting and praying.
But yeah,
you hear of a crisis and you immediately turn right to God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think even I feel that same sort of way, that often my response to things is I want to weep and mourn. And so I think I relate to it in that way, that Nehemiah has this response of weeping and mourning, where some of his kinsfolk might have a different sort of response, right? They might have a response of, oh, that's sad, and go on with it.
There's nothing we can do about it, so.
Yeah. And even Nehemiah doesn't have the expectation that he can do something about it. He has the expectation that God can do something about it.
Right.
And
that God will do something about it.
Yeah.
I beseech you, Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who preserves the covenant and loving kindness for those who love and keep his commandments, let your ear now be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how he opens up.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically chapter 1 with Nehemiah mourning the state of Jerusalem and praying that God would somehow bring redemption to Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And it ends with, "Now I was the cupbearer to the king."
Yeah, I like Nehemiah because it is still a history book, right? But it's uniquely first person.
Yes. Yes.
We noted it with Ezra the other day, that Ezra has 2 chapters where he's writing in the first person.
Yep.
But now Nehemiah writes this whole book in the first person. It starts off the words of Nehemiah, and then the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the first month, I was in Susa. So it starts off even, the first sentence that he wrote down is, here's what I was doing.
Yeah.
And I like that too, just that it's a different perspective on the history. So far we haven't seen that at all. Even, if Moses wrote the law, he doesn't write any of it in the first person.
Right.
And I don't know, I just like that about Nehemiah, that he kind of is just writing down his perspective on what happened.
It's almost like it's his diary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so in that way you get to feel extra connected to him too, of just it's easy to put yourself in his shoes.
Yes. I liked what he says in chapter 2, where he says, I had not been sad in the presence of the king.
Right.
Here's a man he's the cupbearer. What that means is that he was the one who would always take a drink of the wine to make sure it wasn't poisoned.
Yeah.
He was disposable.
Right.
And he was never sad in the sight of the king until he came after his weeping and fasting, and the king says, what's up? This is a sadness of the heart. And then Nehemiah says, I was very much afraid, because he knew that he was supposed to be upbeat and not sad in front of the king. And so then he says to the king, well, let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate and its gates have been consumed by fire? So the king says, what do you want? And then I love what Nehemiah says. So the king has just said, what would you like? And Nehemiah says, so I prayed to the God of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
He could have just said, hey, I want to go there. But instead he says, I want to talk to God.
Yeah.
I want to see what God directs me to say to the king.
Mm-hmm.
That was for me the key verse of chapter 2.
Yeah, and I like that because it's what we see all throughout Nehemiah, right? That's his response, and that's what we've noted before about some of these other great leaders. That's what David's main trait was. That's why he's this great king, is because for every situation he says, I'm going to turn to the Lord and inquire of him. Should we go up into battle or should we stay? And that's, Nehemiah has that same trait. Now the king asks him, even just after all this prayer that he's been having, the king asks him, what do you want?
Yeah.
And Nehemiah turns to pray.
And he gets permission to go back to Jerusalem, and not only that, but to gather supplies that are needed. And along the way, he gathers a couple of enemies.
Yeah.
Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite. It was very displeasing to them that someone had come to seek the welfare of the sons of Israel.
Yeah.
Sounds like today.
Mm-hmm.
So Nehemiah is going to come into Jerusalem, and he inspects the city at night, the gates, and he goes around the whole city looking at the condition of the city. And the Sanballat and Tobiah are joined by Geshem, and they mocked Israel and despised them and said, what is this thing you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? And Nehemiah says, no, the God of heaven will give us success. Therefore, we, his servants, will arise and build. But you have no portion, right, or memorial in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So this is setting the stage for the rebuilding of Jerusalem.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a story, right? Nehemiah's doing something, and people are going to come and they're going to make fun of him. They're going to yell at him from far away.
Yep.
Or sometimes from not so far away, right?
Right.
But, now we get into rebuilding the wall, and I like Nehemiah's role in this. Of course, setting up all these people and just encouraging them.
Most of chapter 3 is recounting who's building what part of the wall,
Yeah.
and I actually appreciate chapter 3:12. Next to him, Shallum the son of Halahesh, the official of half the district of Jerusalem, made repairs. He and his daughters.
Mm-hmm.
Again, women at work in the history of Israel.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. But that's been a main theme that we've been noticing in our reading through, is just the way women show up and are written down.
Yep. And most of the people, it just says they made repairs, they did this. In verse 20, Baruch the son of Zabbai zealously repaired another section. What's yours say in verse 20?
Mine just says repaired, and then it has a footnote saying some manuscripts say vigorously repaired.
So the New American Standard wins this one.
Yeah. I didn't know we were winning or losing.
Something I didn't put a text to, but it was in 2:7, and then it's someplace also, I think, in chapter 3, where it talks about beyond the river.
Oh, yeah. Let letters be given to the governors of the province beyond the river.
Yeah.
And often the river, at least in my Bible, has a footnote that says, this means the Euphrates. So I don't know if this beyond the river is the Euphrates, but in mine, the province beyond the river is capitalized. Makes it seem like it's a name of a name that they translated, which I just think is funny. Sometimes they're translating them, and sometimes they're leaving them in as a Hebrew word or a Greek word. So.
I hadn't noticed it's capitalized in this one also.
Mm-hmm. What does, just because we had talked about this the other day, what does your verse 13 say? how far do they go? Or verse 14. Do they go to the dung gate or do they go to the refuse gate?
Refuse gate.
Interesting.
There's consistency in both translations. So chapter 4, Sanballat and is going to ridicule them more, and Sanballat and Tobiah, and they say, if a fox, look at what they're building. If a fox should jump on it, he would break their stone wall down.
Yeah.
And then verse 4, there is kind of an abrupt switch from what Tobiah and Sanballat have been saying. Mm-hmm. And then Nehemiah says, "Hear, O our God, how we are despised. Return their reproach on their own heads. Give them up for plunder in a land of captivity. Do not forgive their iniquity, and let not their sin be blotted out before you, for they have demoralized the builders." That's pretty strong. And we ought to consider the potential of when we are ridiculing and putting somebody down that maybe our curses are going to be returned to us.
That's interesting. Yours says they have demoralized the builders. Mine says, for they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders.
Interesting.
Just a slightly different thing, but there's still this idea. They're doing something wrong in the presence of the builders, right?
Right.
So,
then I went on to verse 14. The thing is that what Sanballat and Tobiah are doing is working, and people are discouraged. And so then verse 14, Nehemiah says, "When I saw their fear, I rose and spoke to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people. Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses."
Yeah.
Do not be afraid.
Mm-hmm.
The Lord is great and awesome.
Mm-hmm. Nehemiah has shown himself to be an emotional person, but also this great leader of people, that he gathers people well and people want to follow him, right? Even the king was willing to say, "Sure, sounds great. Like, I'll do what you say.
Yep.
Like, you've been good to me." And then now he's also this encourager.
Yeah.
Just shows the multi layers of Nehemiah as a leader, that he's not a judge and he's not even a priest, right? He's just a guy who wants to see his people set free, the remnant of Israel not be burdened under this weight of captivity, right?
Yep. Interesting that the way they respond to the harassment is they're going to start working with one hand. They're going to keep their shield or their sword in one hand and work with the other.
Yeah.
That's going to slow the work down. And it's going to mean that they're going to have to work together,
right,
in order for the work to happen. And then chapter 5 is an interesting interlude, which I don't remember any place else where this shows up, but then again, I don't remember everything. Can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning.
And you have the same thing every day.
So in chapter 5, Nehemiah finds out that the Israelites are loaning to the fellow Israelites and charging them interest, and probably high interest, which of course is directly against what was commanded by Moses. And so he challenges the people. I like what he says in verse 6 and 7. "I was very angry when I heard the outcry in these words, that they were getting charged interest. Then I consulted with myself."
Yeah.
What does yours say?
"I took counsel with myself, and I brought charges against the nobles and officials."
Yeah. He stopped and reflected and thought this through.
Yeah.
He didn't just act rashly.
Yeah.
Think before you act is the lesson of that verse. And so the people say, "Okay, we'll stop charging interest and we'll return people's land that should have been returned." And then in verse 14...
Yeah, we find out that he was appointed governor of the land of Judah, right?
And we find out that he didn't get paid, which probably implies that Nehemiah was had a certain amount of wealth.
Yeah, he at least got to be well off on his own, maybe from being cupbearer.
Yeah, which is interesting because you wouldn't expect that being a cupbearer would be a high-paying job.
Yeah, it's twofold, right? On one hand, you're a disposable guy who's supposed to die before the king. But on the other hand, you have to be the guy that's most trusted by the king because you have to keep him safe.
And I'm guessing that maybe it is a high-paying job because the risks are pretty high.
Right.
It's a whole lot more risk being a cupbearer than being a baker.
Right.
So that gets us through chapter 5. And in chapter 6, the Sanballat, Geshem, and Tobiah are at it again. And they are still trying to mess with the people of Israel.
Yeah.
And when you get to, verse 8, Nehemiah is going to respond and said, I sent a message to him saying, such things as you are saying have not been done, but you are inventing them in your own mind.
Yeah, it's interesting. They come to him and they say, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to overthrow the king? We know that the people of Israel, they love to have their kings, right? And, they say, you've even set up prophets to proclaim that you are the king. And Nehemiah says, I'm not the king. I don't want to be the king. Don't make me king. Nobody's saying that.
So anyway, I'm thinking that this verse is a great verse to, in response to somebody who is just making stuff up or twisting something that happened, and you say, the things you're saying have not been done. You're inviting them and you're inventing them in your own mind.
Yeah.
So that was just, to me, a very interesting response that he recognized that people were making up lies about him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he says, I like verse 9, they all wanted to frighten us, thinking their hands will drop from the work and it will not be done. But now, O God, strengthen my hands.
Yep.
Does yours have O God there?
Yes.
Okay, because mine has a note saying that
italics.
Hebrew lacks the words O God. Yeah.
And they suggest that because Sanballat and Tobiah are going to try to kill Nehemiah, that Nehemiah should hide in the temple. And Nehemiah says, no, I'm not going to hide in the temple. I'm going to let God protect me.
Yeah, I think Nehemiah has two good reasons that he gives for not wanting to go into the temple. First, he says, should such a man as I run away? And then he says, what man such as I could go into the temple and live? So he has this respect for God in two ways, right?
Yep.
If I'm going to be a man who fears God and loves God and trusts God to keep me safe, why would I go into the temple and run away? God's going to keep good care of me.
Plus, I'm not supposed to go into the temple.
And the second part is, I'm not one of the priests. I'm not one of these holy men. I shouldn't be going into the temple. That would be dishonoring God, with a double portion, right?
Yep. So the wall's finished. And when all our enemies heard of it, all the nations surrounding us saw it, they lost their confidence, for they recognized that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God.
Yeah.
There's something about that. When the people of God are successful, when good things happen, people notice.
Right.
And so it was in the time of Nehemiah. In chapter 7, they take a census, which is kind of interesting because when David numbered, it wasn't a good thing to do. And here he's going to count the people who have come into Jerusalem to rebuild the city, and they're going to enroll by genealogies as they have in the past. And it goes through quite a few. There's a lot
names
of verses.
and numbers. Yeah. It numbers all the sons of every person, right?
Yep.
So I thought it's interesting. He finds the book of the genealogy of those who came up at the first.
Yeah.
So this is a book that he's found that has preserved presumably since the Exodus, right?
Yep.
And I just thought it's cool that they have that it's been a few hundred years now, and it's a book of all the people who have been born. And
so what are your favorite names from that passage?
Favorite names? I don't have favorite names. Did you have favorite names?
I have 3.
Okay.
Bakbuk, Basilith, and Darkon.
Okay. Interesting.
That's in 53, 54, and 58.
Uh-huh.
Just the word,
Yeah.
Darkon.
Uh-huh.
Bakbuk. Bakbuk, come here. Bakbuk, stop that.
Yeah. That's funny.
To me, I mean, when you're going through these names, unless you're just going to skip them, you do something to entertain yourself and say, oh,
Yeah.
that's
How
interesting.
does a mother punish a child named, Nefu?
Yeah.
Okay. You could go by Nefu for short, or I understand.
Yep. So that takes us through chapter 7, except I went to verse 65.
Uh-huh.
The governor said to them that they should not eat from the most holy things until a priest arose with the Urim and Thummim.
Yeah.
Again, those items which are ill-defined.
Yeah, and I don't know, are these the same people who couldn't prove their father's houses from Ezra? I didn't check, but the following who came up from Telmelah,
Yes.
Telharsha, Cherub.
Yeah, because
I think Cherub was mentioned, so it probably is the same group of people who could not prove their father's descent. So,
in verse 64, they searched among their ancestral registration, could not be located.
right.
They were considered unclean, and the governor said to them they should not eat of the most holy things.
I thought it's interesting too, just verses 57 to 60, just because it's the sons of Solomon's servants. So
Yeah.
they've listed off these people who are sons of different Jewish people, and it doesn't necessarily say what tribe they're from all the time. It just says they're people of Israel, and probably you could go back and try to find out.
Right.
The men of Bethlehem, those are probably Judah. Okay. The men of Anathoth, where are those guys? But
And this is a few generations beyond when there were any servants of Solomon.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, so it's interesting. It does list names of sons of Judah, and then priests, and then Levites, who not all the Levites are priests, right?
Right.
The priests are just from this line of Aaron. And, but then I thought it was also interesting that it's Solomon's servants. Just because it's first Solomon's servants, not David's servants.
Right.
And just because it's, these people are not necessarily Jewish or Hebrew, but they are brought into the house and brought into the census, right, to be people that are going to be honored in some way.
Yeah. Chapter 8 brings up our friend from yesterday,
Yeah.
Ezra. And that's in chapter 8, verse 1. All the people gathered as one man in the square, and they asked Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had given to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And Ezra brought the law before the assembly of men, women, and all who could listen with understanding. And he read it read from it before the square.
Yeah, from early morning until midday.
Yeah.
So I'm imagining, I don't know, maybe there are specific times for what early morning and midday might look like, but I'm imagining everyone shows up at this town square at 6:30 a.m. and the sun's barely risen, and then everyone's just standing there listening until it's lunchtime, and everyone's hungry and tired.
I think at some point it didn't say that he read for 4 hours. If not, I made it up. But he opened the book in the sight of all the people. He was standing by the people. He opened it. All the people stood up. Interesting. We don't very often stand up with the reading of the scripture.
Right. And we don't often read for 4 hours or however
Yeah.
long, so.
So,
And Ezra blessed the Lord, the great God, and all the people answered, Amen, Amen, lifting up their hands.
so I actually highlighted a whole bunch of verses from chapter 8.
Yeah.
I started with verse 1, introduction of Ezra. And then verse 3, that he read in the presence of all the people.
Mm-hmm.
And then verse 5, he opened a book in the sight of all the people. And then verse 8, they read from the book of the law, translating it to give the sense so they understood the meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And then verse 10, then he said to them, go, eat of the fat, drink of the sweet, send portions to him who has nothing prepared. For this day is holy to our Lord. Do not be grieved, for the joy of the Lord is your strength.
Yeah.
And then on to verse 13. Then on the second day, the heads of the fathers' households of all the people, the priests and the Levites, were gathered to Ezra the scribe, that they might gain insight into the words of the law.
Mm-hmm.
And then I end with verse 18. He read from the book of the law of God daily, from the first day to the last, and they celebrated the feast 7 days, and on the 8th day there was solemn assembly according to the ordinance.
Yeah.
This whole chapter is probably why we look at Ezra as being a great scribe
Mm-hmm.
and having impact on the nation of Israel.
Yeah.
He's a man of the book.
Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine standing and reading for, from early morning until midday, 7 days in a row.
Yep.
In front of a great assembly, right? And I didn't do the math to count up everyone. I don't know even if they did. It says the whole assembly together was 42,000, besides their male and female servants, whom there were 7,000. So there's 50,000 people, and Ezra is standing there, and it does say he has these people with him.
Right.
Ideally, maybe some of these people are helping read, but they're not just reading it all day. They are reading it and translating it.
Yep. And actually, chapter 9 is where it talks about, I misunderstood it. It doesn't say it was 4 hours, but for a fourth of the day. They stood in their place. They read the book of the law of the Lord their God for a fourth of the day, and for another fourth they confessed and worshipped the Lord their God.
Okay.
And we think an hour and a half worship service is too long.
Yeah, sometimes. I find it interesting that they had to translate it because while I was thinking about this, reading this, I'm not writing down pretty much ever, but what verses stick out? But I did notice there was a verse where they talk about the language of the tribe of Judah, the language of Judah.
Right.
And I find it interesting that they call it that and not call it Hebrew or whatever else. We would call it Hebrew now, or ancient Hebrew, but they're calling it the language of the people of Judah.
Yep.
And I guess we know what I found this interesting before, that the people of Judah had a different language than the other people of Israel, right?
Right.
And they couldn't say the same things or had different accents strong enough that you could recognize them.
Shibboleth.
Yeah, you could recognize them
Shibboleth.
clearly. And now we're talking about we have to translate the book of the law. So I don't know if they were probably reading from a different manuscript than we have of our oldest manuscript of it. But just interesting to think if Ezra, if our oldest manuscripts are written by Ezra, his are probably translated into his tongue.
Right.
And then, whatever ones Moses wrote are in a little bit different, and we'd have to learn a whole new language to try and translate that law again.
Yeah. So now in chapter 9, they're going to have this poem, maybe a song. The Levites come and say, "Arise, bless the Lord your God forever and ever," and in a fairly decent psalm. And it's long. It's a ballad telling a story, and throughout they mention significant events in the history of Israel. In verse 8, "You found his heart faithful," this is Abraham, "and made a covenant with him. And you have fulfilled your promises, for you are righteous."
Yeah.
This is a recognition of the people of Nehemiah's time that God is faithful and righteous.
Yeah, and it's interesting because now they're the remnant, right? Without the land. They don't own the land anymore. And they're still saying, well, we're still here. And we know that we're not, keeping the land because we've been unfaithful. But you kept your promise, for you are righteous.
I like what they say in verse 13. "You gave them just ordinances and true laws, good statutes and commandments."
Mm-hmm.
And what is the response of a lot of people to simply the Ten Commandments?
Yeah.
Well, those aren't fair. Why would I have to do that?
Right.
But they recognize that God's laws are just and good and true,
Right.
which I thought was encouraging. In verse 17, it talks about the people of God refusing to listen. They were stubborn, and it says, "But you are a God of forgiveness, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness, and you did not forsake them."
Mm-hmm.
That's, again, a continuous theme. Verse 19, "You in your great compassion did not forsake them in the wilderness. You guided them along the way."
Mm-hmm.
Just their understanding of the history is a history of Israel is a history of the forgiveness of God and His faithfulness.
Yeah, I like 21. 40 years you sustained them in the wilderness, and they lacked nothing. Their clothes did not wear out, and their feet did not swell.
Yeah.
Just that there's this recognition that God was taking care of Israel, even in these times where, or even in these small bits where you would expect your feet to swell if you're wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. You would expect your clothes to wear out. But even those things God provided. He didn't just provide food and water and safety.
And then verse 28, it says, "As soon as they had rest, they did evil in the sight before you, and many times you rescued them according to your compassion." And then verse 31, "In your great compassion you did not make an end of them or forsake them, for you are a gracious and compassionate God."
Yeah.
And then verse 33, "You are just in all that has come upon us, for you have dealt faithfully, but we have acted wickedly."
Mm-hmm.
This is a because of some of the songs we read. I was like, we mentioned, wow, it was kind of hard to get through them.
Yeah.
But I kept being amazed. These are the people who are recounting their history, and in their history they see the faithfulness of God throughout all generations.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I wonder, this is just a different sort of question. I wonder why the translators, at least for the ESV, didn't format it like a song.
Oh, really?
It's just a block of text.
In the New American Standard, it is formatted as though it's a psalm or a song.
Interesting. So I would want to look at other translations and see what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I just find it interesting that in the ESV they decided not to, where for some of these other ones they've put out blocks of text and they're a little bit more center justified. And here it's just normal story, normal paragraphs.
Interesting at the end of it, and this is 9:38. "Now because of all this, we are making an agreement in writing, and on the sealed document are the names of your leaders and our Levites and our priests." But it doesn't tell us what the document says.
Yeah.
It goes into great length in chapter 10 of all the signers and the obligations of the document towards the middle and end of the chapter. But it doesn't... I didn't catch that, this is what that document... This is what they were signing.
Yeah. It seems like they're signing these obligations of the covenant to take on themselves to give yearly a third part of the shekel for the service of the house of their God. It's about tithing. It's about...
I just wanted it enumerated. I wanted to say, point 1, we will tithe. Point 2, we will not intermarry. Point 3,
Yeah, I guess if you want that, we can go back and read Leviticus again.
Maybe not. Maybe not.
But it seems like, from what I understand, they've obligated themselves to take care of the house of the Lord, to take care of the Levites and the musicians and the priests and the gatekeepers, and try to keep these sacrifices as well as they can as a small 50,000 remnant.
Right.
Compared to the 600,000 that they moved into Israel with. Or the 1.2 million that they had at the time of David. So
we get to chapter 11, and my heading says, "Time passes. heads, and it gives it the heads of provinces.
Interesting. Mine just says the leaders in Jerusalem. So
Yeah. And they cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to live in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem doesn't have very many people living in it, and they say we're going to populate Jerusalem.
yeah,
And then the people blessed the men who volunteered to live in Jerusalem.
yeah,
They cast lots. Your lot is you go to Jerusalem. Hey, I volunteer. Choose me.
yeah. It's interesting because Jerusalem, on one hand, is like the city of kings, right? Where
Yep.
it should be the capital city, and everyone should be happy to live there. But on the other hand, it's also the place where people are going to come to war.
Right.
That's the whole story of, when they're building the wall, everyone wants to come and stop them, and they have to build it, a shovel in one hand and a spear in the other. So it's not an easy thing to move to Jerusalem and, have to deal with the enemies of the land.
Right. So most of chapter 11 is naming the individuals who have come into Jerusalem and then is living outside of Jerusalem. I noted in verse 17 that Mattaniah was the leader in beginning the Thanksgiving at prayer. I just like that. Okay, your job, you're going to begin by giving us Thanksgiving in prayer.
It's interesting. Mine just says he was the leader of praise. And you would note that, well, I would note he's the descendant of Asaph, who was, the court musician with David. So, it runs in the family, at least, that he, is a few generations down from one of the writers of many Psalms and, a guy who probably worked together with David to write Psalms too. So,
yep. And the singers are for the service of the house of God. In verse 23, there was a commandment from the king concerning them and a firm regulation for the song leaders by day. The commandment had to do with providing for them.
right.
So what's your job? I'm a singer, because that's a necessary part of our worship.
Yeah. I like just how some of these people are described, at least verse 6 stuck out to me. All the sons of Perez who lived in Jerusalem were 468 valiant men. I just thought it interesting that they're described as valiant men. And then in verse 14, Amashai and their brothers, they're mighty men of valor.
So the sons of Perez are called able men.
Okay.
And the others there are called valiant warriors.
Interesting.
So different words.
Yeah.
They're populating Jerusalem. They're populating the area around Jerusalem. And we move into chapter 12. And then it seems that, we're talking there about the Levites and the Levites came up with Zerubbabel and a couple other guys and Ezra. And it talks about who those people are. And actually in 12:8, okay. In 12:8, there's another guy, the same person who was in charge of the songs of Thanksgiving.
Right.
That to me was a neat thing.
Yeah.
So I drop down to verse 24 of chapter 9. The heads of the Levites, names four people, with their brothers opposite them, to praise and give thanks as prescribed by David, the man of God.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, David comes up as the man of God. Now, we knew he's the man of God, but interesting that this is brought up, that David set the rules for who these singers were going to be.
Right.
And I think it happens again maybe in verse 36. Yeah,
David, the man of God.
with the musical instruments of David, the man of God. I doubt that they, it was the same harp, but the same type of instrument.
Right. And Ezra is there still. He goes before them, so he's leading people, and the people behind him are leading everyone in song.
And then verse 43. On that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced because God had given them great joy. Even the women and children rejoiced, so that the city of Jerusalem was heard from afar.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yours says the city of Jerusalem. Mine just says the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away.
It does say the joy of Jerusalem.
Okay, so you just
brain
you just read the wrong word.
Yes.
That's funny. But it is interesting. The women and children also rejoiced.
Yeah.
I guess for me, that almost feels backwards. It feels like the women and children would be the first to rejoice. I guess if I'm imagining if I'm imagining some of my friends in Ukraine, right, and their families, and they're men who are serving and serving in the military, right, and I know that they're going to be the last ones in their family to rejoice.
Right.
So that for every small victory, their children and their wives are the ones who are holding on to them and bringing them into this upright spirit. And in the opposite side, the women and children are the ones who are the first to be sad, right? They're the first to be torn down, and the man is bringing them back down to the center spot of like, the war's not over yet, we can't rejoice, or yeah, the war's not over yet, but it's still not all so bad.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. This is a paradigm shift for me for the culture of Israel,
Right.
where it feels like now the men are the people who are wanting to rejoice first, and now even the women and the children are rejoicing.
Yeah.
Just, I don't know, a different sort of perspective for me to try and grasp. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that?
No.
Do you feel that same way, or?
I note that the trends in churches in America are that the women go to church and the men don't,
Yeah.
Which would indicate that the women were going to rejoice first.
Mm-hmm.
The women and children go to church and the men do their thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can see that.
Mm-hmm.
So we get then to let's say I had verse 43. That was where the women rejoiced.
Yeah.
And then we get into chapter 13, and I actually don't have anything from 13 except I want to just highlight sections.
Mm-hmm.
They recognize that foreigners are not supposed to be a part of the temple. They recognize that they're supposed to tithe, so that the tithes are restored. And they recognize that they should be observing the Sabbath, and so the Sabbath is restored.
Yeah.
These are the work of Nehemiah and Ezra, because the reason that these are happening is because Ezra has read the book of the law, and and Nehemiah is going, hey, we should be doing these things.
Yeah.
We shouldn't, because that's how it says at the beginning. On that day they read aloud from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and then they found out these things.
Yeah. Yeah. Once again, this issue of intermarrying with these foreign women.
Yep.
And I thought it was interesting. It talks about Solomon in verses like 23 to 27. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women? Among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was beloved by God, and God made him king over all of Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin.
Yeah.
And he says, shall we then listen to you and do all this great evil and act treacherously against our God by marrying foreign women? I like this perspective that Solomon was so wise, so godly, and even he wasn't wiser than God, who said that if you marry these foreign women, they'll make you sin.
Yep. Interesting way that the book ends. Verse 31, I arrange for the supply of wood at appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O God, for good.
Yeah.
Just...
Yeah, and that line happens a couple of times where he says...
Remember me, O my God, for good.
Remember me, God. I've been trying to lead these people towards you. I've been trying to do good.
It makes me think that he had a little bit of insecurity.
Yeah.
That he's working hard to do this, but is God noticing?
Yeah.
Which is something that a lot of people struggle with, in part because we don't have markers that show, hey, God has listened to your prayer. God has blessed you specifically because you did this. And Nehemiah just says, remember me, oh my God. Just remember me.
Yeah. And I think part of that too is Nehemiah is steeped in this idea that the people before have been sinners. Every person before has been sinners. Even Solomon, the great king, was a sinner.
Yep.
And he wants to have God remember him as someone who did something good.
It is interesting that in Nehemiah, maybe because it is kind of like his diary, we don't see him admitting, by the way, I also did this. By the way, I failed in this way. He's just talking about his part in the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, a lot of the good things that he does are not like amazing, splendiferous things. They're just like, they're just things that you cry out to God, hey, save my people. And and God answers, okay, well, the king will send you and he'll provide timber. And
they are normal activities of people who are seeking to please God.
Yeah.
Which is cool. You don't have to be a dramatic leader of nations. Just simply be faithful where God has you.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think in that way, the cry, remember me, oh my God, for good, feels more normal because I didn't do anything special, but nonetheless, remember me for the good things that I did do. They weren't special.
Yes.
And they were yours, God. But just remember me for that attempt, at least.
So that ends our journey through Nehemiah, and we're going to go to Esther next.
Yeah. We'll go to Esther next, and we'll see what she has to say. And Esther is not in the first person. So
No, it's not.
Now we have done our one book that's in the first person, and we'll see if that comes up again. I think some of the prophets are more in first person. So it's interesting. Nehemiah is not a prophet and is in first person,
right?
And basically everything else that is in the first person is a prophet. A lot of these letters from Paul are letters, and you don't really write a letter in the first person necessarily, and they're more letters that are commands, right?
Right.
So, just interesting. Nehemiah has its own literary spot in the Bible, where it's still history, but it's a different type of history than anything we've read before, because it is that first person.
Yep. Well said. Well said. All right. We will come again on the Book of Esther.